My father yelled into the phone screen, his face flushed red against the backdrop of a luxury first-class cruise ship deck gliding over the waves. "You are an ungrateful daughter, Audrey. How dare you ruin the family's $13,000 vacation just because of a forged signature on an $850,000 mortgage paper?" My mother stood next to him, calmly sipping an expensive cocktail, as indifferent as if pushing my grandmother into a cheap nursing home to get money for Marcus to invest was just a minor administrative procedure. I stood in the middle of my grandmother's empty house, where the patchy walls bore the marks of memorial photos they had taken down to sell. My fingertips gripped the sharp edge of the phone until they turned stark white, my breath exhaling a thin white mist in the darkness of the room that had its power cut since the afternoon. They did not know that the crumpled $2 lottery ticket they threw at me 2 weeks ago had turned into a $100 million check, and I had just finished signing the legal documents to become the sole legal owner of this house right before this call started. Please let me share this story with you, but only if you have ever felt like the invisible person in your own family. Drop your location and local time in the comments so I know where you are listening from right now. Now, let me take you back to that Thanksgiving night, so you can understand why this betrayal was wrapped in a $2 lottery ticket. The glow from the phone screen died out, leaving me standing in the absolute darkness of the freezing living room. I set the device face down on the dusty oak table. The winter wind whistled through the broken windowsill, carrying with it a phantom scent of baked pastry from 15 years ago, back when this house was my only sanctuary before the heavy boots of military deployments dragged me far away. I walked slowly into Grandmother Grace's old kitchen. My fingertips traced the rough grain of the oak counter, feeling every ridge and childhood scratch embedded in the wood. I stopped at a small depression near the edge where she used to rest her heavy stone mortar to crush black peppercorns on Sunday afternoons. In my mind, pale sunlight slanted through the window frame, illuminating dancing dust motes and highlighting her wrinkled hands wrapping completely around my tiny ones. She transmitted warmth through quiet, deliberate touches, building a fortress of love that required absolutely no words. I stared up at the white porcelain teapot painted with pale blue vines, resting on the highest shelf. I could still remember the exact heavy weight of that porcelain when I tried to help her pour water at 10 years old. The cool surface against my palms and the cheerful whistle of the boiling kettle used to play like a welcoming symphony. Standing there, my shoulders dropped slightly. I let my eyes half close, trying to anchor myself to the memory of being protected, of being the center of a small, perfectly safe world. That silence shattered the moment Patricia walked in. Her stiletto heels struck the hardwood floor in a rapid, dry staccato that demanded immediate attention. She swung her arm, carelessly shoving the antique teapot aside to make room for her designer leather handbag, never once bothering to look in my direction. Her lips were pressed into a tight, severe line, the wrinkles around her mouth deepening as she adjusted the pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. Her eyes finally swept over my dust-covered army uniform, her displeasure registering in a quick furrow of her brow and a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Audrey, stop standing there staring at that junk like a fool," she said, pushing a heavy tray of stained wine glasses directly against my chest, forcing me to take a step back just to keep my balance. "Get in the kitchen and wash all these dirty dishes from Marcus's party. My precious son cannot stand the smell of leftover food in the house." She didn't wait for an answer. She spun around, the hem of her silk blouse brushing against the oak table, erasing whatever warmth had lingered there. Her thin fingers moved continuously, aggressively rearranging a vase of flowers to her exact liking, commanding the physical space to submit to her presence while completely treating my existence as if I were a walking piece of household appliance. I turned to the sink. My hands, the lean and calloused hands of an Army combat engineer, sank into the warm, soapy water. I watched a single, iridescent soap bubble catch the harsh glare of the fluorescent tube light. I focused entirely on the slippery friction of the water against my skin, using the physical sensation to drown out my mother's complaining voice drifting in from the living room. My shoulders lowered, my spine straightened out of pure military instinct. My eyes locked onto the steady stream running from the faucet, searching for a mechanical rhythm to soothe a nervous system that was pulled tight as piano wire. I grabbed a coarse dish towel, pressing the rough fabric hard into my palms. I dried each glass with the slow, methodical precision of someone diffusing a live explosive, repeating the exact same motion over and over. I inhaled deeply, holding the breath in the center of my chest for 3 seconds, then let it out slowly through my teeth. I concentrated on the physical weight of the glass in my hands, just to remind myself that my boots were still planted on solid ground. I realized then that this house, which had once been my grandmother's genuine home, had been reduced to a cheap theatrical stage for my parents to perform their illusion of wealth. They did not want a daughter returning from a grueling deployment. They only required an unpaid servant to scrub away the remnants of a party thrown for the man they treated as their financial savior. But the dim light in the kitchen could not hide the fact that the numbers on the utility bills and the cleaning supplies were all draining directly from my personal savings account, while an entirely different list of luxury gifts was about to be announced at the dining table. Dinner officially began beneath the brilliant glare of the crystal chandelier I had paid a contractor to fix just last summer. I carried the massive, heavy platter of roasted turkey into the dining room, where the cloying scent of scented candles and the hum of fake laughter suffocated the narrow space. Gerald and Patricia sat at opposite ends of the long table. Their eyes practically sparkled with manufactured pride whenever they looked toward Marcus, while I was handled like a background extra whose only function was to facilitate their meal. I bent forward, my biceps straining against the fabric of my dress shirt as I lowered the heavy silver tray onto the center of the silk tablecloth. My combat boots made a low, dull thud on the floorboards, a heavy sound that contrasted sharply with the relaxed posture of everyone else sitting down. I cleared away the stack of dirty appetizer plates, my left hand balancing the towering porcelain, while my right hand quickly scraped food scraps into a neat pile. I kept my eyes entirely on my own hands, maintaining a perfectly blank expression as their gazes slid right past me. Marcus and Vivian were leaning back in their padded chairs, legs crossed in absolute leisure. Marcus casually swirled a crystal wine glass, angling his wrist so the dining room light would catch the gold face of his Rolex. He leaned further back, a smug smile settling on his lips as he admired his freshly manicured fingernails. Vivian was entirely absorbed in scrolling through her phone, occasionally using a long manicured finger to push a piece of appetizer around her plate. Her shoulders shook slightly as she read something amusing, completely oblivious to the physical labor her older sister was performing 3 feet away. Gerald picked up the carving knife with a slow, exaggerated sense of ceremony. He carefully sliced the thickest, juiciest piece of breast meat, placing it gently onto Marcus's plate with a respectful nod. His hands trembled slightly with the effort of appearing refined. He never took his eyes off his son-in-law's face, eagerly waiting for a compliment. "Marcus, you have been working so hard on those million-dollar Wall Street projects, please. Take the best cut," Gerald said, his voice dripping with reverence. Then, without lifting his head, he used his fork to spear a few dry scraps of meat left on the carving board and shoved them toward my empty spot. "Audrey, you eat field rations in the army all the time, so you probably don't care about the finer things anyway, right?" Patricia let out a loud, ringing laugh. She reached over and patted the back of Marcus's hand as if he were a fragile artifact that needed constant protection. She poured more expensive wine into his glass, her eyes full of raw admiration. In the same fluid motion, she used her sharp elbow to physically push me out of the way so she could make room for a tiered pastry stand. She didn't even register that I was standing there with empty hands. She was entirely focused on anticipating Marcus's needs, her face lighting up every time he spoke, forming an impenetrable alliance that structurally excluded her biological daughter. I lowered my gaze, tracing the woven floral pattern on the tablecloth, just to avoid looking at the blatant spectacle of favoritism. I clasped my hands behind my back, pressing my knuckles together until the skin stretched white. I began counting my breaths in a steady 4-7-8 rhythm, keeping my chest from rising too noticeably. My lips pressed into a firm, straight line. I stood there like a wooden statue, channeling all my awareness down to the soles of my feet pressing into the floor, ensuring I didn't make a single unnecessary movement. I slowly picked up a small silver fork, piercing a piece of wilted vegetable left forgotten at the corner of the serving tray. The scrape of metal against porcelain rang out sharply in the brief silence as the whole table paused to listen to Marcus tell a joke. I chewed slowly, staring at the blank wall ahead of me. My shoulders pulled in slightly, but my spine remained perfectly straight. I wasn't looking for their attention. I was actively playing the role of a ghost in this brightly lit room, feeling the coldness of their alienation seep into my pores while keeping my face as still as a dark lake at midnight. I stood there, a captain who had directed hundreds of personnel through raging floodwaters, stripped of the basic right to ask for a proper meal that my own paycheck had funded. I had been reduced to an invisible caterer, the one quietly carrying the entire structural weight of the family, yet methodically erased from any form of acknowledgement, no matter how small. This invisibility did not stop at the food, because right after the plates were cleared, Gerald stood up with a calculated smile, reaching into his suit pocket to pull out what he called a reward for being different, setting the stage for the public humiliation that was about to unfold. The physical space in the house seemed to shrink when Gerald called me into the corner of the old library right after dinner. The stale smell of damp wood and old tobacco smoke created an atmosphere that was instantly suffocating. He stood deliberately blocking the only exit, his tired eyes projecting a manufactured sense of absolute authority. The hidden pressure from his mounting secret debts made his tone unusually abrasive. He began pulling at old memories, trying to construct an emotional trap designed specifically to break his daughter's will. He stood so close I could smell the sharp, acrid nicotine on his breath. He placed a dry, heavy hand on my shoulder, his thumb pressing down hard into my collarbone in a physical assertion of ownership. His eyes darted nervously around the room, never holding my gaze for more than a second, while his lips twitched right before he spoke. He used his larger frame as a literal barricade, making it impossible for me to step back without crashing into a stack of cardboard boxes. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, smoothing it out with fingers stained yellow from years of smoking. His movements were intentionally slow. The crisp rustle of the paper echoed loudly in the dead quiet of the room. He raised the lottery ticket to my eye level, shaking it slightly like a toy used to coax a toddler. The smile on his face never reached his cold, calculating eyes as he monitored my body for the slightest reaction. Your mother and I sacrificed our entire lives, starving ourselves to pay for your education, and now that you're a captain, you want to come back and calculate debts with your own family? He said. He took a half step closer, his hot breath hitting my face. He poked his index finger hard against my chest exactly on the word sacrificed, the force of his finger leaving a physical dent in the thick fabric of my uniform. This gift is all your mother's hope for you. Take it, and don't you dare act jealous of Vivian's vacation. That is a level of class you will never understand. His eyes narrowed, the red veins showing clearly in the dim light. His voice dropped into a low, threatening hiss, yet it was dressed up to sound like traditional fatherly advice. He watched my face relentlessly, hunting for a sign of submission or guilt. I stood perfectly still. My arms hung loosely at my sides, my fingers straightened out but completely immobile. I focused my vision entirely on a loose thread hanging from the second button of his shirt. I did not blink. I offered no verbal resistance. The only proof that I was still conscious was the slow, measured rise and fall of my breathing. I locked my facial muscles into a state of absolute paralysis, maintaining a solid shield against the toxic wave of words washing over me. I detached my mind from the immediate reality, latching onto the steady, mechanical ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. That dry, predictable sound became my anchor in the middle of his verbal storm. I watched the dust particles shifting slowly in the slice of light bleeding in from the door, each particle looking like a shattered fragment of the family loyalty I had spent my life trying to earn. I felt the solid weight of my boots grounding me against the hardwood floor. The firm contact between my soles and the earth gave me a quiet, untouchable sense of my own real power. I subtly relaxed the tight muscles in my wrists, feeling the blood flow return after moments of tension. I drew my attention to the musty smell of aging paper and printer ink from the surrounding shelves, a scent that represented cold, undeniable facts. I no longer felt the overwhelming weight of Gerald's presence. It was replaced by a flat, empty calm. I watched his manipulation pattern the way I would study an outdated, flawed engineering schematic. I could see the weak joints and the massive, gaping holes in the logic of his selfishness. I realized then that in my parents' vocabulary, the word sacrifice was not a noble act of love. It was a long-term, high-interest loan they used to chain me down the moment I asked for basic fairness. Their affection was simply a binding contract filled with hidden clauses, and I was the one expected to pay the premium with my entire life. Gerald shoved the crumpled $2 ticket into my palm with a mocking pat on the shoulder, entirely unaware that his action was the final blade cutting through our last remaining bond, pushing me backward into the absolute bottom of isolation. After being shoved into the library corner and handed that humiliating $2 ticket, I retreated to my narrow attic room. The fever I had been fighting off since my deployment in the flood zones finally broke through my defenses, making the joints in my knees and shoulders shake violently. I reached out for my phone, clinging to a desperate hope for a minimum amount of care from the people laughing downstairs. But all I received was the cold, electronic tone of a household that had long ago erased my place in it. The attic felt like a low, suffocating box, lit only by the weak yellow glow of an old desk lamp. The air smelled of dry rot and dust. I lay curled on my side on the narrow twin bed, pulling my knees up tight against my chest to trap whatever little body heat I had left under a thin blanket. My trembling hand moved up to touch my forehead. My skin was burning, yet a layer of cold sweat had soaked the pillowcase beneath me. I squeezed my eyes shut and bit down on my lower lip to stop my teeth from chattering. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, making my chest heave unevenly. I stretched my arm out toward the wooden nightstand, my fingertips brushing blindly against the dark glass of the phone screen, waiting for a checking-in message that I knew was never coming. I forced myself to sit up. My back hit the rough wooden headboard, the impact making my spine ache. I grabbed a frayed, old woolen scarf draped over the bedpost and wrapped it tightly around my neck, pulling the ends until my knuckles turned stark white. I stared at my own enlarged shadow cast against the peeling wallpaper. My shoulders slumped heavily under the physical weight of the fever and the crushing, absolute silence of the room. My left hand gripped the edge of the mattress, pulling the fitted sheet so taut it made a tearing sound, while my dull eyes stared blankly at the empty space in front of me. Then, I made the call. "Don't make such a big deal out of everything, Audrey." Patricia's voice came through the speaker, flat and annoyed. "Marcus is right in the middle of telling us about his cruise itinerary, and I am very busy. Just go find some medicine yourself. You've been in the military for years, haven't you?" I let the phone drop from my hand onto the mattress as the call disconnected with a sterile beep. I slid slowly off the bed and onto the hard floor. I pressed my back against the wooden frame, wrapping my arms tightly around my shaking legs. I buried my face between my knees. My hair, heavy with sweat, fell forward to hide my face. My chest convulsed violently with dry, silent sobs that I refused to let out. My hands gripped the thick fabric of my tactical trousers, my fingernails digging hard into my own thighs through the cloth. I needed a sharp physical pain just to anchor myself against the massive void opening up inside me. I lifted my head, letting the tears spill hot over my cheeks and gather at my chin, dropping slowly onto the wooden floorboards. I reached out and grabbed the carved leg of my grandmother's old writing desk. My fingers curled around the rough, textured oak like I was trying to hold on to the last piece of reality I had left. I rested my hot forehead against the freezing wood. I squeezed my eyes shut, my lips moving silently without making a sound. My entire body curled into a tight ball in the darkest corner of the attic, completely alone, while the careless, cheerful laughter of my family echoed up through the floorboards. I slowly let go of the table leg. I used the back of my hand to wipe the wet streaks from my face in one sharp, definitive motion. I pressed my palms flat against the floor and pushed myself up. My legs were still trembling, but they stood firmly on the wood. I walked over to the tarnished mirror hanging on the wall. I pressed my warm hand against the cool glass, looking straight into the shadow of myself. I smoothed back my messy hair. I adjusted the collar of my uniform. My shoulders rolled back, and my spine aligned perfectly, as if I were standing at attention before a commanding officer. The look in my eyes shifted. The cloudy haze of the fever and the crushing pain were completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity like chilled steel. I stood completely still, my arms at my sides. My fingers twitched once, then curled into solid, immovable fists. I reached over and picked up the $2 lottery ticket from the table. I didn't look at it with hurt anymore. I analyzed the printed numbers with the intense, clinical focus of an engineer reading a topographical map. I slowly folded the paper and slipped it into my breast pocket, patting the protective fabric once. I walked to the window and looked down at the dark, empty street, with a face as flat and calm as a frozen lake. I finally understood. Their absence when I needed them most wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was their ultimate confirmation that I had never existed in their hearts outside the role of a supplier. When loyalty is taken for granted, cold, hard truth is the only thing that will ever force them to see me. Before I tell you what happened next, if this story has hit you somewhere personal, hit that like button. And if you've ever had to wipe your own tears and stand back up when the people you loved the most turned their backs, tell me about it in the comments. Now, let me tell you what I did to change everything. I wasn't going to lie there and wait for their pity anymore. I opened the hidden drawer under my bed and took out the brass key Grandmother Grace had secretly handed me months ago. The next morning, I wouldn't be going out to buy fever medicine. I would be going to dig up a completely different kind of truth buried under a stack of mortgage papers at her old house. I drove my car up the overgrown driveway of Grandmother Grace's old house. This was the place where I had grown up wrapped in her quiet protection, long before my parents forced her into that cheap nursing home. Using the brass key she had slipped into my pocket, I unlocked the front door and walked straight to her old study. The room was choked with cobwebs and the smell of decaying wood. Kneeling down in the corner, I pried up the loose floorboard she had told me about, pulling out a rusted tin box that contained the exact secrets Gerald and Patricia had spent months trying to bury. The study was dim, with only a few shafts of dusty light cutting through the gaps in the heavy curtains. I knelt on the rotting carpet, the rough fibers making a dry, scratching sound against my knees. I dug my fingertips into the gap of the floorboard, pulling upward until the wood groaned and gave way, exposing a dark, hollow space beneath. My hand blindly searched the cold cavity until my fingers grazed the freezing metal of the tin box. I pulled it out, wiping away a thick layer of gray dust that coated the lid. My fingers were clumsy as I pried the tight lid open. I narrowed my eyes to adjust to the poor light, reading the bold text on the property mortgage documents folded inside. I stopped breathing entirely when I saw my father's blatantly forged signature resting at the bottom of the page. I pulled out a thick stack of medical billing records with my grandmother's name at the top. I flipped through the pages quickly, my eyes halting on the exact dollar amounts where her essential medication coverage had been ruthlessly slashed. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I locked my elbows against my ribs to keep my hands dead still as I photographed every single page of evidence. The camera shutter clicked rhythmically, a sharp, mechanical sound in the dead silence of the house. I smoothed out a crumpled bank notice detailing Marcus's massive overdue debts. I stared at the red numbers stacking up, my free hand gripping the edge of the wooden desk so tightly my knuckles popped, forcing my body to stop vibrating from the sheer scale of the betrayal laid out in front of me. I sat flat on the floor, leaning my back heavily against the desk leg. I pressed the phone tight against my ear, playing the audio file the lawyer had forwarded me, Grandmother Grace's voice. "Audrey, you do not owe them your life just because they gave birth to you." Her raspy voice echoed through the small speaker. "Keep what belongs to us. The truth always carries its own weight." I closed my eyes, pressing my lips into a hard line. Every word she spoke felt like a surge of electrical current running straight down my spine, reinforcing my crumbling foundation. I reached up and touched the military medal pinned to my collar. I rubbed the textured metal under my thumb. My shoulders slowly dropped, shedding an invisible, crushing weight I had carried for over a decade. I stood up. I meticulously stacked the papers back into the rusted tin, placed the box into the hole, and fitted the floorboard back exactly as I found it. I stepped on it hard to ensure it lay perfectly flat. I walked over to the small utility sink in the corner. I turned the squeaky faucet and scrubbed my hands aggressively under the freezing water, washing away the dust, the rust, and the physical residue of their lies. I looked at myself in the clouded mirror above the sink. I smoothed out the wrinkles in my uniform shirt. My face settled into a perfectly flat, unreadable mask, completely hiding the tectonic shift that had just occurred in my mind. I took one last deep breath, verified the encrypted files on my phone, turned off the screen, and walked out the door. I returned to my parents' house in the late afternoon. I parked my car in the usual spot, taking one deep, calculated breath before turning the doorknob. I walked straight into the kitchen, stripped off my uniform jacket, and tied on my faded cooking apron. I began preparing dinner with rapid, precise movements. I chopped vegetables, the knife striking the wooden cutting board in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. I kept my eyes locked onto the food, maintaining an aura of total domestic submission. When Patricia walked in to check on the food, I looked up, offered her a mild, pleasant smile, and asked about her packing for the upcoming family cruise in a voice that was perfectly even and devoid of any resentment. I carried the heavy tea tray into the living room, setting it down on the coffee table in front of Gerald and Marcus with the practiced grace of a seasoned waiter. I poured the hot tea into the delicate china cups. My hands were absolute rocks, not shaking a millimeter even when Marcus casually threw out a sarcastic comment about military engineers being glorified construction workers. I stepped to the side, clasping my hands in front of my stomach, tilting my head down in a posture of fake respect as I listened to my father and Marcus discuss their grand investment plans. I watched them laugh victoriously about the leverage they had on my grandmother's house. My eyes only narrowed a fraction of an inch, knowing that the real lottery ticket was currently resting safely against my chest. I watched them laugh and joke on the ashes of the legacy my grandmother had built, and I felt nothing but a cold, clinical pity for people building a castle on quicksand. They believed I was just a disposable pawn meant to be sacrificed, completely unaware that I had already shifted the engagement to a controlled environment where every single metric and number was firmly under my control. The farewell dinner before their grand departure to the Caribbean was being set up in the dining room. Gerald had prepared one final theatrical performance to assert his ultimate authority, entirely oblivious to the fact that I had brought a truth that would shatter his entire script right across the dinner plates. The night before the family was scheduled to leave for their $13,000 Caribbean cruise, Patricia prepared the most lavish dinner I had ever seen her cook. Flickering candlelight and the rich scent of roasted meat tried to mask the heavy, suffocating tension coiled under the table. Gerald sat at the head of the table, beaming with a radiant smile as he gestured for me to take the seat directly across from Marcus. The air grew thick with manufactured affection as my father initiated his final sequence to strip away the very last legal right I had to my name. Patricia leaned across the wide table, using a silver serving fork to transfer the most tender slice of beef onto my plate. She flashed me an unusually warm, maternal smile. She reached out and rubbed the back of my hand, her bony fingers stroking my skin with a forced, unnatural gentleness. She started recounting stories from when I first enlisted, narrowing her eyes in an Oscar-worthy display of fake pride while she continuously topped off my wine glass. I sat perfectly still. I watched her hand stroke mine. I kept my lips barely parted, responding to her inquiries with a flat, level voice that gave absolutely nothing away. Gerald leaned deep into the plush back of his lazy-boy chair. He raised his wine glass, his voice booming across the room as he delivered a monologue about family unity during hard times. He looked at me with eyes full of manufactured hope. His fingers tapped a steady, dry rhythm against the wooden table, the sound cutting sharply through Vivian's background laughter. He loudly praised the manual labor I had done fixing the roof last month, using his deep, resonant voice to physically overpower my silence. Patricia nodded enthusiastically at every word he said, weaving a fake, suffocating blanket of intimacy designed to trap me right in the middle of the meal. Then the tone shifted. Gerald slowly pushed a thick, heavy manila folder across the white silk tablecloth, aiming it directly at my clasped hands. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a gold-plated fountain pen, and set it down horizontally on the crisp white paper. The pen hit the desk with a sharp, dry click. The manufactured warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating professionalism. His lips tightened into a thin, hard line as he locked his gaze onto me, measuring my reaction. Marcus and Vivian immediately stopped eating. They stared intently at the folder. A heavy, aggressive silence fell over the dining room, pressing down on my shoulders like physical weights. I looked down at the folder. I kept my hands resting quietly in my lap. I did not reach out to touch the document Gerald was pushing at me. I read the bold, black letters at the top of the page, indicating a property transfer and land use mortgage. Marcus began tapping his manicured fingers against the edge of the table, his patience visibly wearing thin. Gerald didn't blink. He leaned his upper body forward, planting his elbows on the table, using his size to physically invade the space between us. Patricia gripped the stem of her wine glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. She watched my hesitation with eyes that held absolutely zero trace of the motherly love she had faked 5 minutes ago. "This is the power of attorney for your grandmother's estate, Audrey," Gerald said, his voice dropping the friendly act. "Marcus has major partners who require this house as collateral. Just sign it. Consider it helping your brother shoulder the family's future. We are a team, aren't we?" When I maintained my absolute silence, Gerald slammed his open palm down on the table. The porcelain teacups jumped, clattering sharply against their saucers. The mask of the benevolent father completely disintegrated. His face turned a deep, mottled red, the blue veins standing out sharply on his forehead as he hissed threats through his teeth about excommunicating me from the family if I didn't comply. He shot up from his chair, his tall shadow casting a dark pall over my seat. He planted his fists on the table, his heavy, rapid breathing tearing through the suffocating quiet of the room. Marcus leaned in, his eyes turning malicious and cruel. He sneered, making a degrading comment about how a low-ranking grunt wouldn't understand complex financial structuring anyway. Gerald pointed a trembling index finger straight at my face. He issued a high-volume, tyrannical command, ordering me to pick up the pen right that second. Patricia sat frozen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, glaring at me like a hostile stranger who was ruining her luxury vacation. The dining room had transformed into a compressed arena of hostility, directing all its hostile pressure squarely at the woman sitting motionless in the center. I looked at the gold pen lying abandoned on the paper. I saw a lifetime of my silent sacrifice being compressed into a single ink signature, just to fund their leisure. In that exact second, the last lingering trace of fear evaporated from my chest. It was replaced by a freezing, absolute clarity as I realized I was the only person in the room who actually controlled the future of that house. My hand slowly reached out, my fingertips brushed against the cool metal barrel of the pen, and I lifted it off the table. Gerald let out a loud, triumphant exhale. A greedy smile stretched across Marcus's face as he watched me bring the nib toward the signature line. But instead of gliding across the paper to give them what they wanted, my hand stopped dead in midair, and I raised my eyes to look directly into Gerald's face. The gold-plated nib hovered exactly 1 inch above the dotted line designated for my signature. Gerald actually stopped breathing, his torso leaning so far forward he was almost out of his chair, his eyes glued to the tip of the pen with raw, undisguised greed. Marcus flashed a victorious smirk, his hand already twitching forward, ready to snatch the folder away the millisecond the ink dried. But instead of lowering the pen, I slowly rotated my wrist and laid the pen horizontally across the wooden edge of the table. The metal clinked dryly against the wood. It was a small sound, but it signaled a complete and total inversion of power right in the center of the dining room. I reached my right hand inside the breast pocket of my dress uniform. My fingers moved with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I pulled out a standard A4 sheet of paper that had been folded into quarters. I unfolded it piece by piece right over the pristine white silk tablecloth, laying it directly on top of Gerald's mortgage folder. I used the flat of my palm to smooth out the creases, pressing my fingertips firmly into the table to ensure the document wouldn't move an inch. I didn't blink. I stared straight at the highlighted text proving Marcus's financial license had been permanently revoked for fraud, right next to the verified deed of the house legally transferred into my sole name. I maintained perfectly straight posture. I rested both hands flat on the table, framing the new document like an impenetrable barrier. I didn't look at Gerald's face. I didn't look at Marcus. I simply watched the light from the chandelier bounce off the stark white paper. My shoulders were completely relaxed. My breathing was so deep and controlled that my chest barely registered movement. I turned my physical body into an absolute monolith of silence, creating a razor-sharp contrast to the erratic, panicked breathing that was starting to heave from the other side of the table. "What the hell are you doing?" Gerald bellowed, jumping up so fast his chair screeched violently across the hardwood floor. He slammed both hands onto the table. Wine glasses tipped over, spilling dark red liquid across the white cloth like an open, bleeding wound. His face contorted. The muscles around his mouth spasmed uncontrollably, his eyes wide and threaded with thick red veins. He lunged forward, swiping his hand to snatch my paper, but I slammed my palm down on top of it, pinning it to the wood with an immovable, physical force he couldn't break. Marcus surged out of his seat. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly chalk white. His lips trembled, but no words came out as his eyes darted over the exact dollar amounts of his debt and the legal revocation of his career printed clearly on the page. Patricia sat paralyzed. Her hands gripped the pearl necklace at her throat so violently that the string suddenly snapped. The pearls cascaded down her silk blouse and hit the floorboards, scattering like hard, relentless rain. The few guests at the table scrambled backward, pushing their chairs away to distance themselves from Gerald's explosion. Their eyes darted from shock to absolute horror as they listened to the most vile, unhinged curses erupting from the mouth of the man they knew as a gentle, providing father. I stood up slowly. I picked up my document, folded it back into neat quarters, and slid it casually into my pocket. I looked down at the chaotic mess on the table, the rolling pearls, the bleeding wine, the scattered silver. My facial expression did not change by a single fraction. In my mind, I looked toward the living room doorway, almost seeing Grandmother Grace standing there, her old face offering a gentle, confirming smile. I turned and walked straight to the front door. I pulled it open, letting the freezing winter air rush in, instantly clearing out the suffocating smell of roasted meat and stale tobacco. I stood on the porch, taking a massive breath, feeling my lungs expand with actual freedom for the first time in over a decade. I walked down the steps, my combat boots striking the stone path in a sharp, definitive rhythm. I didn't turn back to look at the brightly lit house that was rotting from the inside out, leaving behind the desperate screams of people who had just realized their final prey had walked away. I realized then that the truth does not need to scream to be heard. It only needs to exist, and the lies will collapse entirely under their own weight. When their masks slipped off, I didn't see a mother or a father. I just saw terrified strangers panicking because they had lost their primary tool for exploitation. My freedom didn't begin when the lottery ticket hit the right numbers. It began the second I put the evidence on the table and walked out the door without offering a single word of explanation. Gerald remained frozen at the head of the table, his hands shaking violently as he clutched the now worthless mortgage papers. Marcus sank back into his chair, the horrifying realization setting in that his creditors would find him by morning. I drove away, my red taillights fading into the dark street, closing that door forever and opening a new chapter where the truth was my only navigator. 2 weeks after that explosive dinner, the news of Marcus's financial fraud and Gerald's forged signature swept through their middle-class community like a wildfire. The $13,000 first-class cruise was violently interrupted when Marcus's bank accounts were frozen, and federal authorities met them at the very first port of call to escort them back for questioning. I was now living in Grandmother Grace's house. It was a quiet, minimal space, completely isolated from the chaotic tidal waves crashing down on my parents and sister in their old house, which was now flooded with aggressive foreclosure notices. The morning sun poured into Grace's living room, lighting up the clean, dust-free corners. I sat by the large window, holding a hot cup of coffee. I watched a pair of sparrows hopping across the bright green lawn outside. I set the cup down on its porcelain saucer, the ceramics meeting with a soft, pleasant clink. My eyes drifted to the local newspaper resting on the coffee table. The bold headline detailed the local investment scam. I didn't pick the paper up to read the details. I just looked at it the way you look at an object that no longer belongs in your universe. My hands leisurely turned the thick pages of a structural engineering textbook. My fingers moved with a smooth, relaxed grace, entirely stripped of the tight, vibrating tension that used to live in my joints. I walked over to the wooden bookshelf. I took a soft microfiber cloth and gently wiped a thin layer of dust off my grandfather's old brass compass. I picked it up, flipped the heavy lid open, and watched the magnetic needle swing steadily until it locked onto true north. I closed the lid slowly and set it back in its exact place with absolute reverence. My movements were unhurried. Every step I took across the hardwood floor produced a solid, grounded thud. I paused in front of the hallway mirror to adjust the collar of my crisp white shirt. My face radiated the deep, settling calm of someone who had walked straight through a hurricane and emerged without a single scratch on her spirit. "Audrey, I'm so sorry. Vivian stood in the doorway. Her face was hollow and exhausted. Her eyes were swollen red, and her hair lacked the meticulous, expensive styling she used to flaunt. She held her trembling hands out in front of her, clutching the fabric of her own shirt desperately. Her head bowed low, entirely unable to meet my eyes. Her lips quivered. Every word she forced out was accompanied by a suppressed, choking sob that made her narrow shoulders shake violently. She took a hesitant step toward me, then immediately shrank back. Her legs looked like they could barely support her weight on the polished wood. The blinding arrogance that used to define her had been completely eradicated. I stood perfectly still. I did not reach out to pull my sister into a comforting hug, but I also didn't step back in disgust. I looked at Vivian with a flat, level gaze, silently observing the total collapse of a woman who had spent her life treating me as her shadow. I turned, poured a glass of filtered water from the pitcher, and set it on the wooden table nearest to her. My movements were definitive but lacked any trace of hostility. I stood there, my shoulders squared, my back straight. I waited patiently for her to stop crying. My silence in that moment wasn't designed as a punishment. It was an impenetrable boundary, a physical manifestation of the dignity I had permanently reclaimed. I gently placed my hand on Vivian's shoulder. It was a brief, light touch, but it served as an acknowledgement of her physical presence. I guided her to sit on the soft cushions of the sofa. I walked to the kitchen, brought back a box of tissues, and handed them to her. I did not offer any empty, comforting platitudes. I sat in the armchair opposite her, resting my hands quietly on my knees. I listened as she explained how Gerald and Patricia were being actively shunned by their church community, and how Marcus had fled the state with whatever cash he had left. I listened with the detached patience of an outside observer. My eyes only narrowed slightly when she described my father's final, desperate attempts to lie his way out of the debt. I stood up and pushed the window open wider, letting the crisp scent of freshly cut grass wash into the room. I picked up the manila folder containing the trust fund documents Grandmother Grace had established for me. I separated a specific stack of papers and slid them across the table toward Vivian. I tapped my index finger twice on the top sheet. It was a managed allowance. It was enough to help her start a basic, simple life, completely free from the toxic financial manipulation of our parents. I watched the profound shock wash over my sister's face. I simply gave a short, acknowledging nod. Then I turned around and walked into the kitchen to prepare a simple afternoon tea, laying down the very first bricks of a new relationship built purely on hard truth rather than comfortable illusions. I looked at Vivian and realized that the truth is sometimes the cruelest natural consequence for those who choose to live in lies, but it is also the only cure for the victims caught in the crossfire. My parents chose the illusion of prestige over their own children, and now they had to sit in the absolute void of that fake prestige. I no longer felt any burning desire to retaliate. Standing tall and living a good life was the most devastating answer I could possibly give them. Vivian left the house holding a small folder and a tentative new hope, leaving me in the home that now legally and spiritually belonged to me and my grandmother. The aggressive foreclosure notices kept flooding the mailbox at Gerald's old address, where he sat completely alone in the dark, stripped entirely of the artificial power he had spent his life demanding from everyone around him. A full year passed after the night of that dinner. I had officially completed my final tour of duty with the Army Corps of Engineers and dedicated all my time to renovating my grandmother's property into a community support center. The air around the house was now filled with the sound of local birds and the rich, earthy scent of the deep red dahlias I had planted by hand along the entire length of the driveway. My daily life settled into a slow, autonomous rhythm. Every single decision I made belonged entirely to me, completely untethered from the heavy expectations or the blatant favoritism of the family I had left behind. I stood on the white-painted wooden porch, The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow over the blooming dahlias at the foot of the stairs. My hands were streaked with damp brown soil from turning the earth around the new roots. I used the clean back of my wrist to push a stray lock of hair away from my forehead, squinting slightly to admire the physical results of my afternoon labor. I walked over to the heavy wooden porch swing. I carefully placed my grandmother's old reading glasses on the polished side table, my fingers lightly stroking the smooth, treated wood. I took a massive, deep breath, pulling the scent of wet soil and clean floral air deep into my lungs. My shoulders relaxed completely, my body merging seamlessly into the absolute peace of the fading daylight. I picked up a heavy copper watering can. I tipped it gently, watching the water cascade over the red petals, leaving small droplets resting on the green leaves like tiny, perfect crystals. My boots moved across the porch floorboards with a soft, easy tread. The heavy, defensive march of my military boots was gone, and so was the anxious, rushing pace of a daughter trying to outrun her family's demands. I paused in front of Grandmother Grace's framed photograph, hanging right beside the front door. I took 3 seconds to adjust the wooden frame so it hung perfectly straight. A quiet, genuine smile touched my lips. It was a solid spiritual connection that reminded me I was never actually alone in this space. The phone resting on the wooden table suddenly lit up. The vibration buzzed steadily against the wood. The screen flashed the caller ID with my father's name. I glanced at the device, shifting slightly from the vibration. I didn't rush to grab it. I stood perfectly still. My hands, still bearing the dirt of my garden, rested easily at my sides. There was no spike of anger in my chest. There was no lingering resentment, and absolutely no fear tightening my throat. I watched the screen with total, unshakable calm until the ringing timed out and the glass went black. When the buzzing stopped, I slowly reached out. Using my clean fingertips, I picked up the phone and gently placed it face down on the table. I didn't block his number. I didn't disconnect the line. I simply chose not to step back into the chaotic whirlwind of their demands, excuses, and blame ever again. I left the door of communication unlocked as a silent testament to my own capacity for grace, but I simultaneously enforced an iron boundary. My life was now permanently out of their jurisdiction. I turned my back on the phone and walked back to my flowers, carrying a profound, strange serenity in my chest. The familiar rumble of a car engine sounded at the front gate. I looked up and saw Vivian stepping out of her compact car, carrying a small canvas bag, a bright, unburdened smile on her face. I walked down the porch steps to meet her. I reached out and took the bag from her hands in a natural, warm gesture. We walked up the stairs together. I pointed out the new blooms, explaining how much water the roots needed. Our hands brushed against each other occasionally, a physical contact rooted in genuine affection. I poured hot tea into Grandmother Grace's vintage china cups and set them on the round table in the sunlit living room. I sat back and watched Vivian relax into the sofa cushions. We spent an hour talking about her new job and her future plans. Not once did we bring up the ghosts of Gerald or Marcus. I felt a deep, anchoring relief seeing my sister finally learning to stand on her own feet and discover who she actually was. I shared my management experience with her, discussing the cold realities of budgeting and planning. We were actively building a new family structure from scratch, one based entirely on mutual respect and actual support. Sitting in that bright room, I realized that extending forgiveness to the people who are actually willing to change is the final key to completing your own healing. Real family isn't defined by people who share your blood, but treat you as a functional tool. Real family is defined by the people who choose to stay and love you exactly for who you are. I had left the $2 lottery ticket and decades of manufactured pain in the rearview mirror, choosing instead to hold the keys to a house filled entirely with light and truth. But before you go, I want to ask you something. If you could go back and say one thing, just one honest thing to the past version of yourself who was enduring that injustice, what would it be? Not to fix it, just to say your truth. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and if Audrey's story made you feel a little less alone tonight, that's everything I could have hoped for. There's another story linked in the description waiting for you. I reached out and flicked off the porch light, letting the farm sink into the quiet safety of the night. I stepped inside and pulled the heavy door shut, closing it gently but with absolute certainty. Behind that door was a world I had built with my own two hands, a world where the truth was respected, and where love never arrived with a bill attached.